That we call the Arizal Hachai. The Arizal is called the living Ari, and most people assume that it refers to the fact that he's such a big tzaddik, so just like by Yaakov Avinu, there's no concept of an interruption of life, so by the Arizal also, there's no interruption. Some people understand it, yeah? But I believe that Arizal Hachai is the same thing as the Ba'al Shem Tov referring to his master, his teacher, Ba'al Hachai. Ba'al Hachai means the levels of the neshama called Chaya Yechida. Now the way you understand it is fantastic. It's mamish unbelievable. If you're mizboinen in it, it's unbelievable. Because what it says is, we all learn about the neshama. In Chassidus, of course. And we learn about the meeting of the neshama and the guf, the soul and the body meeting. And we further learn about the difficulties there are in the neshama and the body, the soul and the body converging. Because the body is, after all, a physical casing, a physical garment for something godly, for something which is not just spiritual. Spiritual is itself a fantastic concept. But something which is so deeply connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so deeply connected to the Eibishter, that the concept of limitation doesn't really exist. And the soul and the body converge. It's a hard thing to fathom that a finite body, a complex, finite, orderly body, which, as the Alter Rebbe writes in Perek Memtes, Nidme b'chumer yusei l'gufa yomes ha'elam, all human beings look the same. Adam Rishon and Avraham Avinu, and the simplest person has the same plumbing, same basic design. Yes. And yet, it's possible for something so esoteric, something so lofty as a soul and a body to converge. And of course, Chassidus talks about it, Kabbalah talks about it and struggles with it. And they explain that there's a whole fancy process. Right? There's a lot of words that you would use in context to explain how the soul meets the body. And one of the words, and we'll use this one word, it'll be enough for our discussion, is the word hislapshus. Hislapshus means when the soul and the body converge, the soul has to change to suit the body, has to be enclosed within the garment of the body. So the neshama cannot remain what the neshama is. The neshama has to be adapted to be able to go into the body. And that itself is very complicated. There's levels, and there's places, there's nefesh, there's neshama, there's the ruach, there's neshama, and so on. Then you have tzaddikim. So by tzaddikim, the body is purified, either naturally or through work, so more of the neshama is revealed in the body, etc., etc., etc. When you speak about a human being, a neshama b'guf, and you identify him as Ba'al HaChai, Chaya Yechida, what you're saying is that this person's neshama meets this person's guf, and the neshama is not changing. The neshama is remaining what the neshama is. And yet, it enters into the body and functions through the body, forgive me for using these words, like a normal person. In other words, it's not just a high neshama. There are many levels in neshamas. But when you identify a soul by Chaya Yechida, what you're saying is that the levels of the neshama that have nothing to do with the body are invested in the body, and the body holds them, and the body reveals them. So this is literally a concept of a soul being in a body without any limits. Without any limits. And to find language for this, and I don't want to spend an hour on I wanted to just say this for a few minutes. The language for this would be, imagine a person who's so smart that all the wisdom in the world is easy. It's effortless. They have to acquire knowledge, but to store the knowledge and to process the knowledge and to organize the knowledge and to integrate it is effortless. There's smart people and there's smarter people, and there's even smarter people. We understand that, right? We call the smartest people in the world geniuses. And I want to observe that when you identify a person as a genius, there's a specific connotation. Whether it's intended or not, it's true. A genius means someone who's outstanding in only one way. And in all other ways he's ordinary, which is why geniuses are frequently imbalanced. I always say this, there's a difference between a genius and a great person. A Rebbe is not a genius, he's a great person. Why? It fits. It fits. Why does it fit? Because all of him is great, you understand? The highest madrege of a great person, that it fits is when you identify a person by Chaya Yachid. The levels of the neshama which are not connected to the guf are held in the guf. So the lower levels of the soul, which is the neshama would be the mind, and the ruach would be the heart, and the nefesh would be the basis for proactivity, for actions, are completely subsumed, completely secondary to this incredibly powerful higher level of the neshama. These are people, when they open up a Sefer Torah, they don't see words, they don't see idea, they see Ein Seif. Now, some people could open up the Sefer Torah, and I never met them, and they don't see words, they don't see idea, they see Ein Seif, but they can't talk to you. Because they're there and they're not here. Some people don't have those limitations. They open up a Sefer Torah, they don't see words, they don't see idea, they see Ein Seif, and they can talk to you, your language. In other words, it's the ultimate combination of contradictory attributes that makes a person, I mean, we call this person a Rebbe. I don't necessarily think it has to be a Rebbe, but people who are so whole, the highest levels neshama, are fully manifest in the body, but they're fully manifest in the body on the level that the body is. And they're able to interface with other people like regular souls. This is extraordinary. And the Ba'al Shem Tov calls his Rebbe Ba'al Chai. My teacher Ba'al Chai. He never says his name. In the Ba'al Shem Tov's own writings and letters, when he references Moiri V'Rabbi, he refers to my master, my teacher Ba'al Chai. And again, I think that this is similar to what we say about the Arizal Achai. However, a lot of the ideas of the Ba'al Shem Tov we have from the Ba'al Shem Tov's disciples, Ba'al Shem Tov's students. Amongst the most preeminent is the Toldos Yankov Yosef. Yankov Yosef of Polno. He was the first Talmidim of the Ba'al Shem Tov, and he wrote many Sfarim. He wrote a handful of. The first Sefer Chassidus ever published was not the Tanya. It is the Sefer Ben Peiros Yosef from Yankov Yosef Polno, and in that Sefer you have the famous letter of the Ba'al Shem Tov that the Ba'al Shem Tov met Mashiach, and he said to Mashiach said, the Ba'al Shem Tov said to Mashiach, when are you going to come? And Mashiach said, Tenu answered him, when your wellsprings are going to be spread to the outside. That's printed in that Sefer. The Toldos Yankov Yosef has many big Sfarim. They're nice Sfarim. They're not just 2 lines. A lot of Teres of the Ba'al Shem Tov, and he says that this is Moiri V'Rabbi, and people have collected from the various. There's another famous source of Teres of the Ba'al Shem Tov. The Einik of Ba'al Shem Tov had a grandson whose name was the Degel Machne Ephraim, the Ephraim of Sidlikov. He was the older son of the Ba'al Shem Tov had a son and a daughter. The son's name was Reb Tzvi, and we know very little about him. His daughter is much more famous, and the great Hasidic Rebbes that come from the Ba'al Shem Tov directly are mostly from his daughters. The Moshe of Nachman Breslever was a great grandson of the Ba'al Shem Tov from his daughter, Odel. Her name was Odel. And her older son was the Degel Machne Ephraim. His name was Ephraim. I don't know if he had more than one name. Ba'al Shem Tov's father-in-law was Ephraim. Ephraim, abroad. I'm assuming that he was named after his great-grandfather. So Degel Machne Ephraim has a sefer where he quotes many teres of the Ba'al Shem Tov. He had a much younger brother whose name was Baruch of Mezhebush. The Baruch of Mezhebush is very famous. He was born after Ba'al Shem Tov passed away. He never knew his grandfather. But his older brother, Degel Machne Ephraim, was a makabel from the Ba'al Shem Tov. He sat by the Ba'al Shem Tov's feet. And they wrote down a lot of the Ba'al Shem Tov's teachings. And there are Sfarim that you could buy called Ba'al Shem Tov, which are compilations of teachings of the Ba'al Shem Tov from the various other Sfarim that are very reliable. In other words, direct first, the second Talmidim, people who heard Torahs from the Ba'al Shem Tov directly and wrote them down, they've been compiled. And years ago, there was a tkufa, there was a period when the Rebbe would teach Torahs of the Ba'al Shem Tov, which are not in our Sfarim. The Kesser Shem Tov, the Tzavos Arivosh, but on these other Sfarim as well. But anyway, the Toldos Yankov Yosef writes, I think more than once, that my Rebbe told me that his teacher, who he refers to as the Ba'al Chai, is Achiya HaShiloni. Achiya HaShiloni. The Rambam writes about Achiya HaShiloni that Meyetze Mitzrayim Hoya. The Rambam writes about Achiya HaShiloni that he left Egypt. The Koton Hoya B'mei Moshe, and during Moshe Rabbeinu's lifetime he was small. Now you could translate small as youth, young, but I don't think that's what the Rambam means. When the Rambam writes about Achiya HaShiloni v'kotan hoya b'mei Moshe, he means compared to the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu, he was kotan. And he had a very long Arichas Yom. He lived 500 years. And at some point, he became the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. This Achiya HaShiloni was the Nasi of Sanhedrin. The Rambam lists 40 generations of Teda, of the transmission of Teda from Moshe Rabbeinu until Ravina Ravashi, who wrote the Gemara, which is a period of 1500 years, be'erach. I can't do the math on my head, but it's more than 1500 years. And he lists who the leaders were of each generation that transmitted the Teda. So you have Moshe, and you have Yeshua, and you have Rizkenim, and you have Elazar, and you have Pinchas. Right after Pinchas, you go to Eli HaKohen and Shmuel HaNavi, and then you have Nasan, and then you have God, and then you have Achiya. I may be making a mistake. One of the people is David HaMelech himself. I'm probably making a mistake or two, but Achiya HaShiloni lived long enough to become the Gadol Hador. And L'choira, the pshat is, he reached long enough that the level of Neshama Yisrael was such. In the times of Moshe Rabbeinu, he was cut. He was a regular guy. 500 years later, he was the Rebbe, the Nasi Adar, Achiya HaShiloni. Achiya HaShiloni was the teacher of Eliyahu HaNavi. And it's a letter from the Rebbe, which is, it's not really a letter from the Rebbe. There was Yid in Eretz Yisrael, whose name, there's a book about him, Tzaddik in our times. He's a very unusual man. Ba'al 11. He was a Litvak, he was not a Chassid, but he was an Emes Yid. Ba'al 11. He was a very special man. When he passed away, I read someplace, his son came to see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asked him to talk about his father. So when he started talking about his father, the Rebbe stood. The Rebbe gestellt. The Rebbe used to send him every year matzahs for Pesach, a whole matzah. He was a very unusual man. So Ba'al 11 had a Chushan Emes, Pashat. He was a real person. There are real people. He was a real he was a Litvak, but he was an Emes Yid. And he studied Chassidus. He wrote the Rebbe a letter saying that he heard from somebody that the proof that Chassidus is higher than Kabbalah is the fact, and I may be misquoting, but the letter is printed in Igros Kodesh, you could look it up, that the Kabbalah that we have from the Arizal was taught from Eliyahu HaNavi over the course of 7 years. And the Teres Chassidus, the Ba'al Shem Tov learned from Achiya HaShiloni, who's one generation closer. He's the generation earlier. Because Achiya was the Rebbe of Eliyahu, and he taught the Ba'al Shem Tov Chassidus over the course of 10 years. So he wrote to the Rebbe that he understands from this that Chassidus is deeper than Kabbalah because of these 2 points. That it took longer to teach, and that the teacher came from an earlier generation. And the Rebbe writes back, it sounds good. The Rebbe doesn't say it's true. Es klingt sich richtig. And I have to say to you, I've looked up this letter many times, but I'm not repeating it precisely. This is a rough version of it. I may have some of the fine edges wrong, and the fine edges may be very important. But the klolos ha'inyan is azoi. The basic idea is as follows. So Achiya HaShiloni lived in times of the first Beis HaMikdash. And the Rebbe once discussed, it's in the Sichos, look at the Sichos, why he had to teach Chassidus to the Ba'al Shem Tov. And he said, because Achiya HaShiloni brought about the Churban of the first Beis HaMikdash. And since he brought about the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, he has to be the one to rebuild it, because Chassidus sets the way for the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu. How did Achiya HaShiloni set the stage for the Churban? Because he was a Navi. You know what the story what a Navi is? You learn Chumash, yeah? The Eibishter puts a bit in your mouth and says, Shuva Bolog V'chai Sadaber. When a prophet has given words to speak, he has to say them whether he likes them or not. He has to say them whether they're good or not. Nevi Hashem had to say terrible things. Why? The Eibishter forced him. I heard a tape where the Rebbe is complaining about a certain Jew who's criticizing other Jews. And the Rebbe says, he's not a prophet. Prophets don't have a choice. Prophets are forced to speak the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even if they're difficult, because the Eibishter forces him. Like yesterday's Chumash, we were sitting yesterday in Shul and listening to 69 psukim of who knows what, and you're thinking, Mamish, all of this, we need all this information, we need all this detail. Unfortunately, our history has borne out what it says in the Chumash, but alles das ein verschrieben. Und danach steht, and gam kol choli v'lei mak kol maka, hashaloi ksuva b'sefer HaTorah hazeh. Even the ones that are not written here, yeah? So I don't know the Eibishter's business, but Moshe Rabbeinu's business, we understand. Moshe had no choice. Hashem says to Gemara says, Kshev, you write what I tell you. Someone wants to misunderstand that's his business. Prophets have to speak. A Chacham doesn't have to speak. If you are surmised, but you're a great Chachma, that something is in the Yidden's mind with the Matzav is kach v'kach, you don't have to open, forgive my candor, your big fat mouth and announce to the whole world your great wisdom. First of all, who knows if you're right? And even if you're right, who knows if it has to be said? A Navi has no choice. Achiya was the Navi who divided up the kingdom of David and Yisrael. Because the Shlomo HaMelech, the Gemara speaks about this, the Tanakh speaks about it, did things that were not good, and everybody was afraid of him. The only person who had the guts to criticize Shlomo HaMelech correctly was Yeravim ben Nevat. The Eibush told Achiya, chafe after Yeravim ben Nevat, Jeroboam, and give him 10 tribes. And he was running away to Mitzrayim, he was running away from Tzlok, because Shlomo wanted to kill him. And he ran after him, and he grabbed the tail of his coat, he tore off a piece of cloth, he tore it up into 10 smaller pieces, and he handed it to him. And he told him the Eibush that took away the Melucha from David HaMelech, and he's giving it to you. And you should understand that if you'll behave, so you'll have opportunity to elevate the Jewish people and to earn for yourself a lot of schar. Yeravam immediately became one of the biggest Rishoyim ever. He was such a big tzaddik that when Shlomo was ruling over the whole world, he was the only one to open his mouth. The moment he acquired power, he became, the Mishnah says, Chata v'hechti, ein lechelek lamba, Yitzem Yerav Menavat. And it was Achiya's mission. Achiya was given the mandate by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do this. So the Rebbe said, Achiya did the mission of the Eibishter. He didn't have a choice. But the fact of the matter was that through him came something which is historically terrible for the Jewish people. So therefore, it becomes on him to correct it, even though he had no choice. He had no choice. But von deswegen, nevertheless, since through him, since through him came this difficult thing, it became his mission to correct it. And the Rebbe said that's why he had to come to the Ba'al Shem Tov and teach him. He had to teach him Chassidus, Yechida, the highest level of Torah, which we talked about yesterday in the Fabrengen, which is a Torah based on the principle of Yahavta l'reich hakamoicha, which is what Chassidus is. It's a Torah based on the principle of Yahavta l'reich hakamoicha, which is to prepare the world for the coming of Mashiach Tzidkeinu. Now you should know, and I don't know this much because I'm not a maven, but if you look in Zohar, there are certain personalities that are very preeminent, that are mentioned a lot. Not all the Nevi'im, not all the Tanoim and Amirayim, I mentioned certain ones are clearly outstanding in the Zohar. Some of them were alive during the time of Reb Shimon, some lived before him, and you even have those who l'chayra lived after him, who would come to the Zohar, they're mentioned by name. And one of the most frequently mentioned names in the Zohar is this Achiya HaShiloni. Achiya HaShiloni, Eliyahu HaNavi, Moshe Rabbeinu, Mashiach. But a lot of very, very great Yidden do not appear in the Zohar. Some do, and some don't. But Achiya HaShiloni, who lived hundreds and hundreds of years before the B'Shem B'Yachai, is mentioned in the Zohar a lot. And he was the teacher of the Heilig Ba'al Shem Tov. So yesterday was the 300th anniversary of their meeting. Yesterday, Chai Elul, Tov Shin Pei Dalid, 2024 was the 300th anniversary of the meeting of the Ba'al Shem Tov and Achiya HaShiloni. He met him on his 26th birthday, Chai Elul Tov Pei Dalid, that's 1724, plus 300 is 24, you know exactly, it's 300 years. In other words, Chassidus turned 290 years old yesterday. Because in 10 years from yesterday is going to be the 300th birthday of Chassidus, from the time that Ba'al Shem Tov revealed himself. Now I want to share with you a kasha, mitateretz. It's a very big kasha. We have a letter of the Ba'al Shem Tov, where the Ba'al Shem Tov describes meeting Achiya HaShiloni. And first of all, it's Erev Shabbos Kodesh Pashas Vayeshev, which is in the winter. And there was 3 or 4 feet of snow. And there was a whole story out of Shabbos. He saw him in a dream, he saw him in the mikveh. There's a whole bunch of details to the story. So how do you reconcile that with this fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe says so emphatically, and the Rebbe repeats it in the Hayom Yom that he met him on Chai Elul? So of course the answer to that question is I don't know, but I think in the letter the Ba'al Shem Tov writes that every day he would meet him, Achiya HaShiloni, and they would go out into a cave outside the city and they would learn. After learning for 9 months, the Ba'al Shem Tov describes this. He walked me back to the entrance of the city and he asked me, do you know who I am? They'd been learning together for 9 months, he didn't know his name. So the Ba'al Shem Tov says, no, I don't know who you are. So he revealed to me, Ba'al Shem Tov says in the letter who he is, but he doesn't write. He doesn't write the name, he simply writes, he revealed to me who he was. And the Ba'al Shem Tov says, when I heard with whom I have the zchus to learn, I fell to the ground in fear. So my cheshbon is 2 things. Number one, that we don't count the Ba'al Shem Tov is learning with Achiya HaShiloni from when they started to learn. You only count the learning with Achiya HaShiloni once the Ba'al Shem Tov knew who his Rebbe was. And it's a little bit consistent with the Gemara, with Chassidus brings. Chassidus talks about the idea of seeing the face of your Rebbe, looking at the face of your Rebbe. The difference between a student who only hears the voice of his Rebbe and a student who not only hears but he also sees what the Rebbe is saying. And the Gemara says, the Gemara is about the Meir, about the Rebbe. You must understand, in those days, when they learned Torah, it depends on the tkufas. They either stood or sat. They stood in rows around the Rebbe. And the Rebbe would sit and the Talmidim would stand. And the way it was arranged was the greatest students stood in the first row facing the Rebbe. And the first row was the greatest students, and the second row was the second, and so forth. Rabbeinu HaKadosh was in the first row by Reb Meir, but he was behind him. And he saw his back. So he says, if he implies, had I been able to see the face of my Rebbe, I would have been even greater. So you have to say that there's a similar idea by knowing who your Rebbe is. If you're looking into your Rebbe's face, when you know who your Rebbe is, L'chayra the Ba'al Shem Tov was a maven. Yeah? L'chayra the Ba'al Shem Tov was not an ordinary man, and nevertheless, he learned with him for 9 months, and when he told him who he was surprised. In other words, it was more than he understood. And apparently, this is my explanation, that the Ba'al Shem, we don't count the 10 years that the Ba'al Shem Tov lived with Achiya HaShiloni. From the time that they started to learn, we count the 10 years from the time that he knew who he was. And the second of them is you have also a little bit in the Buddhism indirectly. 9 months before Chai Elul is exactly Yitzchak Kislev. Now we have calendars, you could look it up, you could figure out the math. Was it Sunday? You could be Yitzchak Kislev, I believe. And they started to learn on a Sunday. He saw him in a dream on Friday and Shabbos. Oh my! Anyway, so today is a very important anniversary. It's the beginning of the Ba'al Shem Tov learning Torah from his Rebbe, and then of course 10 years later, the Ba'al Shem Tov would reveal himself as a Rebbe, and he spread Chassidus. And Chassidus is, as the Mashpiyim like to say it, it's l'mayla mayla adein keit or l'mata mata adein tachas. Chassidus is the kind of thing that the greatest Jew can be benefit from, can be elevated by. And Chassidus is the kind of thing that the simplest person is also touched by. In other words, in contrast to Kabbalah, which is also Seder HaTorah, the secrets of the Torah. But Kabbalah speaks only to people who have hechsher, who are prepared. Bidiru kol advarim, tiknu kol hamaisim, like it says by a Torah. You have to be close to perfect for Pnimiyas HaTorah to even reach you. Chassidus, because it's deeper, and of course we don't know what we're looking at when we learn Chassidus. We think we know what we're looking at, yeah. But Chassidus, because it's deeper, has this advantage that it talks to every person. The greatest of the great benefits from Chassidus, and the simplest of the simple is also touched by Chassidus. This is the gift of the Ba'al Shem. This is the gift of Yechidish HaBenefesh. Anyway, so I needed to point this out.